Hello, everybody, and welcome to the tracking webinar. This is the big finale of Summer Stand-Up Week, and I'm so excited to have you here. When I was getting ready for this webinar, was really kind of dialing into what feels most important to share, because you could track anything, you could track everything. It's definitely a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I want to share what's worked for me, what's worked for my clients, and kind of think about how we can use tracking to measure the immeasurable, how we can use tracking to put boundaries around things that naturally don't have them, and how it can help us make better decisions. So with that in mind, I definitely have my eye on the chat. If there are things that are coming up, if you're watching it live, I'm so excited to have you here. Maybe you're watching the recording later. I'm also really excited to have you here, and let's get into it, as they say. So a little bit of an agenda, just so that you know, we're going to talk about the why of tracking, why I think it's useful, the parameters under which it's useful. We're going to talk about how to do it, so tools you can use, apps you can use, things like that. When to act on the data that you gather. So what does it look like to lead a sort of data-driven life? And then number 4, what's next? So where do we go once we get all that data? So I'm excited to have you with me, excited to have you here. The cats are locked out. And so we'll get started with number 1, which is, of course, why track? So as a coach and as a person who lives in the world, tracking is something that I came to naturally on my own with a sort of sense of shame about it. When I was in graduate school, I would talk to colleagues, I would talk to professors, and they would say, well, I'm really excited. I get up every morning. I can't wait to write. I can't wait to read. This is my calling. This is my vocation. And I was like, how do I know when I'm done? Like, how do I know when I've done enough for today? How do I know when I've done enough reading? How do I know when my dissertation is done? How do I put some boundaries on it? Because it was actually really disorienting. It wasn't great for my anxiety. It definitely wasn't good for my brain chemicals to have all of these tasks open in front of me that in theory had a done point. Like, there's some minute where you're going to be done with your dissertation, obviously, but how do you know? Like, how do you know when you're done reading? Or how do you know when you're done writing? And so I found that tracking is a way for me to get some data around what was otherwise a really abstract concept. And by getting that data and having something concrete that I could hold on to, that I could touch, that I could see, that I could look at patterns, it turned what was a sort of amorphous blob in the middle of my day. Like, okay, I'm going to go to work and then I'm going to stay there until who knows, and then I'll be done. Tracking helped me put some boundaries around that. It helped me see some patterns, and it helped me really alleviate the sense of shame, because I felt like the fact that I wanted to know when I was done was meant that I was a bad grad student. That if I was truly a good scholar or a good grad student, then I would never want to be done. I would just want to sort of live the life of the mind. And I really think that learning to put some boundaries on it, learning to think about what makes you feel good, what makes you feel less good, is actually gives you more time to do the work that you're actually interested in. And it's definitely been true of the clients that I've worked with. So many of the clients that come to me and sort of in my community or for one-on-one coaching, they say, I get up in the morning and I'm worried that I'm not doing it right, that my schedule isn't optimized, that I'm not as productive as I can be. And I say, okay, like, what is that feeling based on? What data do you have that you're not doing it right, that you're not doing enough? And they say it's a feeling. And that feeling is so valid. The feeling that we're not doing enough is baked in to the academic system. It's baked in to the capitalistic system, I would argue even. That it's really hard to know what's enough, because it's in academia's best interest for it to never be enough. So it's not just that you're a grad student and you need to teach and you need to research and you need to work for your PI and you need to have drafts for your advisors, but you also have to have side projects, and you have to have plans for your career and future scopes. And there's so much, and you literally can't do enough. There will always be a sense that you could do something more. And I know that for an example that I think is really useful, I went into my dissertation the day of my defense. So in theory, it's all done. I'm here to talk about it. It's public. And I was like, my parents asked me, they said, "Are you excited to be done?" And I said, I think I am. I think I'm excited to be finished with this project. And then the defense was all about, well, what are you going to do with this next? What are your side projects? What are your goals? There's never really a finish line. You think you're going to take a break, and then you really can't. So that's a long way of saying that if you start to track some things, if you start to get some data about, how many hours are you actually putting in? How long does it take you to read an average article? How long is normal for you to get from sort of chapter beginning stages to a finished draft? The more that you have some actual numbers, the more that you can start to plan with accuracy, the more you can set deadlines that you can reasonably meet, the more that you can say, okay, like I'm done for the day. I'm done for the week. I hit my goal. I met my target. So tracking helps you put some boundaries around that. I also think that tracking will help you figure out what your rhythms are and what you can best do and not do. So in my newsletter this week, I talked about the experiments that I run all of the time. I run them as a human, I run them as a coach. And the example that I think is the shining classic one, and the one that I repeat, is if you go 2 steps into any of the academic productivity corners of the internet, you're going to see somebody who says that the key to academic productivity is getting up early and working first thing in the morning. And if you get your morning block of work done, and then the rest of your day is yours. It's going to decrease your stress. It's going to help you publish 100 articles a month. And I think that for some people, that's really good advice. There are some people who really thrive by having a routine. They love having sort of the decision of when they're going to get up and what they're going to do made for them. And they do their best work from 6 to 8 a.m. It's useful for me to remember that that might not be true. It might not be true for you. It might not be true for the next person. So the way to test whether this is going to be useful is to actually run an experiment. And that's what tracking is in a lot of ways. It's gathering data for ongoing experiments about your working life, your other lives, the balance, the schedule, what things are working. Because if you have the data, then you can make data-driven decisions instead of taking on the sort of advice or the strategies, even the things that coaches say. If it doesn't work for you, it's not the right tool. And the only way to know if it works for you is to actually do that experiment and track it. So that's my pitch about why we can do it. I also, though, think it's really important to add this caveat. So if pitch 1 is, I think you should track, because the more data you have, the more data-driven decisions you can make. Then step 2 is to say, once you get the data, this is not an open invitation to shame yourself forever. So I say that because I fall into this trap all of the time, where in the last sort of 2 weeks or so, I've been really trying to do my meditation first thing when I get to my desk in the morning. And I have an app that I'm happy to share the name of, and I check it off. And I was tracking it because I wanted to see if I meditate first thing in the morning when I get to my desk, will I have more focus when I start to do some of my other tasks? That was my hypothesis. I'm running it, but it's really easy for this tracking thing. Am I doing my meditation? Yes or no. Is it having an impact? Yes or no. To turn into, am I doing my meditation? And if I didn't, I feel really bad. But sometimes you just don't get there. Sometimes you don't. And so the trick to tracking is to take it as the data source, but not take it as the absolute evaluation of how you're doing as a scholar, as a person, as a human being. It's just data. And as any good grad student or scientist is going to tell you, data is important. Data is what we use, but data isn't the whole story. There's always extenuating circumstances, different conditions, things that are changing. Data is part of the story, but it's not all of it. So, Katie, I want to track. Let's get into the details. How do I do it? How do I track? Which is part number 2 of this webinar. How do I track? And I think it's a pretty easy to wrap your mind around 3-part system. First, get a hypothesis. What's your hypothesis? So, like I mentioned, my hypothesis is that if I meditate when I get to my desk first thing in the morning for at least 5 minutes, it's going to have an it's going to impact my focus in a good way. So that's my hypothesis. You design an experiment around it. I'm going to try this for 2 weeks and see what happens. And I'm going to meditate for at least 5 minutes. And then I'm going to check in with my mood at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. I'm going to see if there's any correlation at all. And then you gather the data. So how are you going to actually track that? I use a habit app that I can have different habits. I set little reminders. It's very low weight. I just click yes or no. In other seasons of my life, I have done it in bullet journals where I say, okay, like here's my meditation. Here's the chart. Did I do it? Yes or no. Here's my mood. Yes or no. Maybe it's in a Google Sheet where you say, okay, this is how many words I wrote today. This is how many words I wrote the next time I wrote. Here's what I can see from those numbers. Here's a graph. Maybe it's something that's actually pretty complicated. Maybe you use an app like Bearable where it says, okay, like here are all of the things that's going on in my day. Here are all of the patterns. Here are all of the things that you're checking in on. But I would really encourage you to not overcomplicate it. And I think that when it comes to the how, that's the biggest tip that I can share, is that if the tracking itself is becoming a huge suck on your energy, on your time, if it's complicated, if you need to track it in 6 different places, then you're not going to do it as consistently. And the idea is, what's the minimum amount of friction that I can add into my schedule so that I can get the data that I want? There are some things that feel really motivating. So for you, it might be, okay, I have a Post-it note, and every time I check my email and don't avoid it, I check something off on that Post-it note, and every check that I see on it really motivates me. Maybe it's important for you to put it on your phone, because I know that for me, when I open up the home screen of my phone, I see the Habits app right there. There it is. And it reminds me, like, okay, I meant to be tracking these things. There's some data that I want. Maybe I do that first, and it's a gentle reminder before I, scroll my life away on Instagram. It doesn't stop me from opening Instagram sometimes, but it is a good reminder. So make it something that's easier to do. If it's a complicated bullet journal setup that takes you 2.5 hours every month to reset, and then you have to do it a couple of different times, maybe that's good creative time for you. Maybe you love playing with your markers. Maybe you love having a part of your month where you do the spreads and you evaluate, and you love playing with your stickers. Or maybe you just learned about yourself that it's not going to be something you can do consistently. That when push comes to shove, you want to spend those 2 hours doing a hike or sleeping or doing your laundry, and the bullet journal is just never going to make it up that hard. So you have to do something that's preset. Maybe you get a worksheet and you make it once and then you just print it out, and it's not as beautiful, and it's not in a bullet journal, and it's not bound, but you can do it, and it's useful, and it only takes you 30 seconds to print it out. So tracking, getting the data, it's important. It's important to bring that mindfulness in. It's important to notice what you're doing and when. But the more that you can kind of adjust and say, okay, how can I get the data in the way that's going to least impact my routine and get me the most amount of visibility? Because the point of getting all of this data is to then move on to step 3, which is when to adjust. And this is a question that is underneath probably 80% of the consultations that I have. Because I would say that most grad students and most of the clients that I work with, they have a beginning set of data. And they never believe me when I say, okay, like this is the data, this is what we have. But for example, I was working with a client and that client said, I'm so agitated. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not getting to my desk until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'm feeling really anxious about it. And I keep trying to say, like get up at 6, and I sleep through my alarm every time. And it starts my day off just in a terrible way. And I say, okay, let's look at that as data. What you're telling me is you keep setting an alarm at 6, you sleep through it 90% of the time, and every time you sleep through it, you feel really bad. You feel like your day is kicked off on just the wrong foot. It's ruined from the moment you get up, and you're in such a spiral about that it's hard to get yourself motivated until later in the afternoon. So that's a set of data. What conclusions can we adjust from that? Maybe 6 a.m. is not your wake-up time. 6 a.m. is not my wake-up time. I do not do my best thinking first thing in the morning. I need a pretty leisurely morning to get myself situated, to get the coffee I like, to get my notebooks out, to do my reading. I like to meditate first thing in the morning, and it's just not going to happen at 6. So maybe you push that alarm back and you say, okay, 6 isn't working. Let's try 8. And then you notice that, like, okay, yes, I'm not getting those 2 hours back, but I'm also gaining all of this time because when I start my alarm at 8, I feel ready to be at my desk at 10. And that's so much earlier than collapsing into my desk at 4 p.m. in just such a state of guilt and stubborn and overwhelm. So the rule about when to adjust is anytime you want to. If it's not doing what you want it to, if you're not feeling the way that you want to feel, then try to change something. I know that it's so easy to say, okay, my life's a mess. The summer isn't going the way I wanted to. The semester isn't going the way I wanted to. I'm just going to change everything. And if I can just stick to this schedule, it will fix all the things that I want to fix, and then I'm going to be able to move on. And maybe that works for a while. Maybe you were really drifting into later mornings, and that isn't feeling good. You say, I'm going to start getting up at 8 o'clock. It works for a couple of weeks, and then you go on vacation, or then you get sick, or then, it's a really terrible string of weather and it's cloudy and humid and you don't want to get up, and then you start getting up at 9 and at 10. We change all the time. And what worked for you 2 weeks ago might not be what's working for you now. So the big question is, when do I shift? When do I change? And I would argue as a coach that the most effective thing is to be changing little things pretty frequently. So maybe your morning routine is pretty solid, you feel good about it, and you're noticing that, it's starting to take you an hour and you really want to keep it under 45 minutes. So instead of saying, okay, I need to sit down and brainstorm an entirely new way to start my day, maybe you cut down one of those things. Maybe you say, okay, I really like to journal and meditate, and it's too much time. I'm going to move my journaling to the end of the day when my brain is already fried. Cool. Try it. Adjust things. You can adjust things. It feels destabilizing to always be in a state of change. It feels like you're not doing it right. But often, the people who are adjusting on that micro level, a couple of minutes here, I'm trying a new app here, I'm working on this new zone over here. If you're making those little changes, it's easier to stay in the flow. It's easier to catch the things that are kind of dragging you off track a little bit earlier. It's easier to say, this isn't life or death. This is just me moving my alarm by 15 minutes. This isn't life or death. This is me trying, a new routine or a new app. But the more that we can say, there is no perfect system, there's no perfect schedule that's going to work all of the time and keep my anxiety in check and make sure that I'm the best person that I can be. There's no perfect schedule that's going to work for every season. And there's definitely no perfect schedule that's going to work in a world that's as unstable as this one. So adjusting a little bit more frequently can feel like you're not doing it, that there's always something wrong. But in reality, it's more about being flexible and changing when things change. And you can't control most of what's going to change. So controlling how you react to it is probably the better bet long term. So When to adjust? Always. And then circling back to kind of what we talked about at the beginning, if you're changing all of the time and viewing that as this isn't something that's wrong with me, this isn't something that feels, this isn't a problem that I need to solve. This is just the way that it is. So I'm changing all the time. My routines need to change all the time. I have to track them. And that's just the way it is. This is my ongoing maintenance. Ongoing maintenance isn't a problem. Ongoing maintenance is proactive. Ongoing maintenance is something that's going to help you see things earlier. And that kind of brings me to our last and final point. What's next? What's the end game of all of this? So I'm tracking my data. I'm seeing, okay, this is what meditation does for me. This is what my routine does for me. This is the impact over here. How do I implement that? And I wish that I could tell you that if you just track enough and if you just schedule enough and you just experiment enough, eventually you'll find the perfect thing and this will be solved forever. You'll never be unproductive. You'll never be unfocused. And the reality is that I wish that there was. If there was a perfect schedule, please know that I would trademark it. I would patent protect it, and then I would sell it to everyone. And I would be the richest person because I would have the perfect schedule. But as each one of us has our own needs, our own specific brain chemistry, and it's really important to tune into what helps you feel motivated. And so I'll be very frank. There are some seasons in my life where it is very motivating for me to have my checklist of things where I say, okay, here's my morning routine. I check off my 5 things. I started my day off right. And then there are other seasons where having a 5-step checklist before I even kick off my day feels so overwhelming that I can't even imagine it. That if the bar is any higher than roll out of bed and get into your desk, I'm not going to do it. And those are just different seasons. Different people need things at different times. I really want to empower you more than anything to get the good brain chemicals. So if the good brain chemicals are coming to you, if the dopamine hit is posting your word count on Twitter and getting a couple people to like it, then that's what's working for you. Use that data. If you go on Twitter and you post your word count, it feels like gentle accountability and you get the dopamine hits, good. You're not hurting anyone. It's not a problem as long as being on Twitter isn't going to completely distract you for the rest of the day. And if it does, then you say, okay, it completely distracted me. I did lose that half an hour. Now I'm circling back. But the brain chemicals, what motivates you, those little hits, maybe it's in your app, maybe it's in your bullet journal, maybe it's in a bunch of those things. The more that you track and the more that you're like, okay, this is what I said I was going to do. It's small, but I got it checked off. Then the more that you can kind of set up an example for yourself that says, I set out to do these things, I did them, and then I feel good about it. And that really brings me to the end game, which is in a world where you truly can't do enough. There's no way to bend the time-space continuum to do every single thing that every person is suggesting graduate students need to do in order to get the job, be well prepared, have enough publications, be a great teacher, be a great mentor, be a good volunteer, also be a human, also keep your house in order. It's too many things. So you have to put some boundaries around it sometimes. And sometimes those boundaries look like, okay, these are the 5 things that are most important to me. If I get these 5 things done in a day, then that's a pretty good day. Everything else is bonus. So tracking at its heart is setting more reasonable expectations, more reasonable goals that you can hit. It's not to say that you don't overachieve sometimes, you do. But the more that you can set reasonable goals, hit them, and then adjust when you need to, the more you're setting up a system, an agreement between you and yourself that says, I'm not going to hold you to impossible standards all the time. I'm going to hold you to the standards that make sense for the goals that you've identified. And if you hit those, then we're going to get those good brain chemicals. Because if you're waiting for academia to swoop down and say, this is enough, it literally never will. Some advisors are really good and they'll tell you this is good work, But you might not have one of those advisors. You might not have a graduate program that says really clearly, these are our expectations for you. So it's hard, but setting those for yourself can be really useful and really empowering. And the trick is that this is a life skill that's going to be useful if you get a different job, if you move into academia. There will always be more that we can do. But the more that you can say, this is what I'm responsible for, this is what feels good to me, this is what I'm focused on right now, not forever, not for always, just for this season, and I'm open to changing it, the more that you're going to set up a system where you can say, okay, this is enough. And if you can say, this is enough for today, or for the week, or for the summer, or for the semester, then it's so much easier to say, I did enough and now I can rest. And if you can balance that, the enoughness and the resting, the enoughness and your humanness, then you're winning. You're not just winning as a grad student, you're winning as a human. So I hope that this was like a high-powered, useful thing, a framework. I know that it's really sexy to be like, here's an app and here's the app that's going to change it. But I think that saying tracking as a skill, as something that you can use, a tool that's in your tool belt, is even more useful. So thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to keep adding more content to this channel. The newsletter will resume as normal next week. If you haven't checked your inbox yet, there's a really good discount and sale that is time limited. So I am wishing you a most supported week, a most supported summer, winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, and I can't wait to see you again soon. Bye, everybody.